loose from infirmities and disabilities, loose from all that hinders me. Nothing can hold me now. I'm standing on solid ground. The word of the Lord. I've got the victory over my enemies. Who the sun sets free is free indeed. My chains are broken. Thank God I am loose, loose, loose. Oh yes I am, yes I am. I am loose, loose, loose. Oh yes I am, yes I am. I am loose.
Hello, Salem Bible Church. I am Dr. David Clark, clinical psychologist and professor emeritus at the University of New Brunswick. And it is a great pleasure today for me to join you for this Bible series called Loosed. I want to thank Dr. Joseph Williams, senior pastor, and Reverend Jasper Williams, professor emeritus, for inviting me to participate in this series. So it's wonderful to be with you. Just to let you know a little bit about myself, I am a clinical psychologist and professor emeritus at the University of New Brunswick. I was trained, I received my PhD in clinical psychology from the Institute of Psychiatry, University of London in England in 1984, and then did some postdoctoral work at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School in the late 80s under Dr. Aaron T. Beck, who is the founder of cognitive behavior therapy. So for the past, I would say 35 years plus, I have been offering a psychological treatment to individuals suffering from depression, anxiety, and obsessive compulsive disorders. I've also written several books on cognitive behavior therapy and treatment of these conditions, as well as numerous research papers. So it is my pleasure to be with you today and for us to delve into this subject called self-depreciation. And I have given it a subtitle as well called A Relentless Sense of Failure. So let's start out by looking at what we mean by depreciation. So we often use, if you look at the dictionary definition of depreciation, it refers to the act of cheapening or devaluing or writing off or downgrading. Okay, so we often use the word depreciation with in reference to maybe purchases we've made. So you can think of your car, for example. As your car gets older, it depreciates in value. It's worth less than you paid for. The same thing for furniture and appliances. They also depreciate. They seem to become worthless quite quickly. And so we often use that term depreciation with regards to commodities or purchases that we make. It's probably less known in terms of using the word depreciation when it comes to ourself. The opposite of depreciation, though, is appreciation. Appreciation. And again, if you look at the dictionary definition of appreciation, it talks about being grateful for something, an ability to understand the worth, quality, or importance, or to have full awareness, understanding of something. So for example, you can think of someone who has an appreciation of fine art. Unfortunately, I don't seem to have that appreciation. I can remember going to many different art galleries in Europe. And although I enjoyed the paintings and the famous artwork, I wasn't one of those persons who would stand for, let's say, an hour looking at a particular piece of art. I just can't seem to remember. I remember looking at the Mona Lisa when I was in Paris once and thinking, well, that's very nice. I wonder, and really standing there and trying to understand what made this one of the great pieces of art in the world. But I'm sure somebody who appreciated fine art could actually stand there for maybe hours observing, really kind of taking in the full quality and the worth of that wonderful painting. The same thing when you think about music. People who have an appreciation for jazz or classical music, one person could listen to, let's say, a piece of jazz and say, well, it's nice music and that's about it. But somebody else who has a great appreciation for jazz would be able to listen to that and really understand its worth and quality and value. They could really delve into it. So appreciation is the opposite of depreciation. So what about when it comes to the self? Us as individuals, how do these two terms actually apply? Self-depreciation, and then what I'm going to refer to as self-appreciation. And so you see in this slide that I've contrasted the two. So let's start with self-depreciation. This refers to one aspect or characteristic, let's say, of self-depreciation is the tendency to engage in a negative self-evaluation. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to explain how important self-evaluation is to our own character development and our sense of self. But what happens in self-depreciation is there's this tendency to generate a negative self-evaluation. In other words, the person caught in self-depreciation is often thinking negatively about the self. They're very self-critical. They can easily spot their faults and mistakes and shortcomings. So that's probably the core of self-depreciation, this tendency to engage in negative self-evaluation. On the other hand, if you can think of self-appreciation, it might be a tendency to engage in positive self-evaluation. So in this case, the person is thinking possibly about their successes or their strengths, and they're often engaged in positive talk or positive self-talk, right? So you can see the two contrasts. We all have negative and positive aspects to ourselves. In self-depreciation, you're focusing on the negative. In self-appreciation, you're focusing on the positive. The second thing about self-depreciation is this tendency to express a low opinion of yourself, maybe by emphasizing your faults. So the person caught in self-depreciation is often talking about their faults, maybe talking about their faults or their shortcomings to other people, to family members, to friends. You might actually, as a friend, you might pick this up and you might think, well, boy, they don't have a very good opinion of themselves. So they're often expressing this negativity. It's not just something internal, but they express it to others. On the other hand, somebody with self-appreciation is able to express a more balanced, realistic opinion of themselves. Okay, so they can talk about their strengths and their successes, and also, though, they're able to express their mistakes and their shortcomings. But they tend to have a more reality-based opinion of themselves, not excessively negative or not excessively positive. And I think in some of your other topics that you've dealt with, like in arrogance or so on, that would not be self-appreciation. That would be over the top. That wouldn't be expressing a balanced, realistic opinion of yourself. That would be in a sense of going overboard on what you perceive to be your successes and your strengths. The third element of self-depreciation is that the person tends to hold a defeatist or hopeless outlook for themselves. So when they think about not only who they are right in the present moment, but when they start to, they also think about the future. They think about themselves, their future, as hopeless. They don't see themselves as succeeding. They don't see themselves as having the ability, let's say, to overcome some of their problems or whatever. So their future can look rather hopeless and bleak. On the other hand, somebody with self-depreciation, self-appreciation would have some vision and hope for themselves in the future. They can recognize that they do have possibilities. They see themselves as being able to overcome the difficulties in their life and maybe even having a better future. And finally, with self-depreciation, we often find that people will belittle themselves. Again, this would be not only expressing a low opinion, but they may express a great deal of self-criticism and even almost self-hatred in the more extreme case. Self-denigration, we call it, where they're putting themselves down and making themselves even of less value than they really are, of course. So the person with self-appreciation, though, is able to recommend or endorse him or herself to other people. So you can imagine, for example, if you're in a job interview, and the person with that tendency to self-depreciation might tend to underestimate their ability. They might express some doubt, let's say, on whether they would be able to be able to do the job they're applying for. They certainly wouldn't be putting their best foot forward. However, with someone who has a self-appreciation, they would be able to perform in a job interview. They would be able to speak honestly and openly about their strengths, what they could bring to the job, whether they would be able to be a good employee, and so on. So you can see these two opposites, self-depreciation and self-appreciation. Now, our goal in this particular talk is to be able to move from self-depreciation to self-appreciation. So as we go through the talk, today, I want you to be always thinking about, okay, if I'm caught in self-depreciation, how might I move towards self-appreciation? And that's kind of the overall goal of the talk today. So how are we going to get there? That is, how are we going to move from self-depreciation, which is that negativity toward oneself, to a more positive view of oneself, the self-appreciation? And I want to focus on 4 aspects of how we might get there. First of all, I'd like to spend just a few minutes to help you to understand the necessity of self-evaluation. The necessity of self-evaluation, because it's important to be able to situate this problem of self-depreciation as an aspect of the self. And I know many of the speakers have talked about the self, because as soon as you talk about character flaws, you're talking about the self. That is who I am. So I want to also, like probably some of your other speakers, spend a little bit of time on self-evaluation and to understand self-depreciation from that perspective. The second thing I want to do is to delve into the origins of self-depreciation. There's no question that some people have much more negativity about themselves than other people, right? There are some people who have very little negativity about themselves, and there are other people who have a great deal of negativity about themselves. In other words, all they can see is the negative in themselves. And then there are a whole bunch of people, maybe most of us in the middle, that, we kind of have a little mixture of both. But let's look at the origins of self-depreciation. And then I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of self-depreciation and why I believe this is such a critical topic for not only for Christians, but for everyone. why self-depreciation is such an important topic, for our mental health and our personal growth and well-being. And finally, we're going to talk about strategies, empowerment strategies, how you can move from self-depreciation to self-appreciation. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing to notice is when we talk about the necessity of self-evaluation is the importance of the self. We all have to have a sense of who am I, who I am. And the emergence of a concept of self is critical to life itself. We cannot live life without knowing who we are, without having a sense of self, because that sense of self will direct our thoughts, our emotions, and our behavior. So how we behave is an outgrowth of the self. Our emotions, sadness, anxiety, fears, anger, frustration is an outgrowth of the self. And our thoughts, what we think about other people, what we think about ourselves, and how we evaluate our life and even our relationship with God is affected by the self, this sense of who am I? So the self is absolutely core and critical. And that's why psychologists spend so much time with people working on aspects of the self. So not only is the self necessary to live, but we develop a sense of self by our qualities. What is it when we think, okay, who am I? Well, we tend to think of who we are by a list of qualities. And I've given us just a few examples. Some of these qualities can run into dozens and dozens of qualities, whether we are well liked by others or not, whether we see ourselves as intelligent or successful or organized or reliable or conscientious or loving or spiritual. These are all qualities that we refer to in terms of defining who we are. So if you're high on some of these qualities, or if you think you're low on some of these qualities, so for example, friendliness, you could say, well, I see myself as a very friendly person. And other people think I'm a very friendly person. I have no problem starting a conversation with people or asking them about how their day is, or smiling or whatever. But and that may be a sense of who you are. You are a friendly person. On the other hand, maybe you're an unfriendly person. Maybe you don't find it easy to talk to people, to ask them about their day, to start a conversation, to smile, or to be friendly. So, that would be one dimension or one quality, friendly versus unfriendly, that we tend to use to define who am I. The self, though, is so important that I'm going to call it soul related. The self is soul related. And if you think of Genesis 1:26-27, we read in those passages that God said that he created man and woman in his image. We are created in the image of God. And we also know from Exodus 3:14 that God himself has an image and a sense of self. When Moses said, well, who will I tell the children, or who I've spoken to, God tells Moses, I am who I am. Yahweh, I am the I am. And in a sense, you could say God is the ground of self. God is saying, I have a self, and the self is I am who I am, the I am. So we could say that the self is soul related. Now, I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to try to suggest whether the self is our soul or not. I'll leave that to a smarter and more educated people, at least let's say theologians. But I think it's fair to say that the self is soul related. And finally, the self is not something we're born with. We're born with the ability to create a self, but it's through our life experiences and our interactions with others that we learn who we are. That newborn infant, that baby who starts out with no sense or hardly any sense of self, very quickly is starting to develop a sense of, I am separate from my mother, my father, my caregiver. I'm a separate being. And then through childhood, adolescence, and even well throughout our adult life, we're learning and developing this sense of who we are. So the self is very, very critical to our core, let's say, psychological makeup. And what goes along with that sense of self is a self-evaluation. That is, what's my value? This, we could call this our sense of self-worth or self-esteem. And how do we do that? This self-evaluation feeds into the self-concept, who I am. Well, we evaluate ourselves by comparing ourselves to other people. This is just a very natural thing to do. As humans, we are social beings. We can't help but compare ourselves to others. So if we think of ourselves, am I smart or am I not so smart? Am I intelligent or not so intelligent? We might settle that, decide on that by comparing ourselves to our peers, our family members, and so on. So we're constantly doing that. We do that in childhood, we do that in our adolescence, and we continue to do that through adulthood. We compare ourselves to other people to, in a sense, to get a sense of what our value is. But we also can get a sense of our value, our worthiness, our worthwhileness through what we're told about our value, about what we hear about our strengths and weaknesses. And when I get into the origins of self-depreciation, I'll be talking about childhood and family experiences, because it's during childhood that is probably the most critical time period where we're forming this sense of who we are and what our value is. So what we learn through our childhood experiences, what we're told, what we're hearing about us, who we are as an individual, has a big impact on this sense of value. Thirdly, we also get a sense of our value through through our perceived successes and failures, through our abilities. So we all have successes and failures. And each time we have that type of experience, it helps to impact, it has an impact on what we think is our worth and value. So I can remember I went to Bible school for a couple of years, and the Bible school I went to had a big music program. And maybe some of you, as I'm speaking, you have great musical talent. And so you might not quite appreciate the example I'm giving, but I can tell you that I have very little musical talent. It just doesn't run in my family. But when I was in Bible school, a lot of emphasis on music. So a lot of my friends were very musical. And so I really wanted to participate in this. And so I remember taking voice lessons. Now, teaching me how to sing is a little bit like trying to teach a cat how to talk. No matter how good the lessons were, I just did not sing like, I just couldn't get it, right? And I remember having this concert where all of the students had to sing a recital. I guess it's a music recital. And the guy before me probably had the richest baritone voice that in the entire school. Just what a beautiful job. And then I had to get up and I had to sing. And I remember that to this day, even though it was probably about 40 years ago. I still remember it to this day because this was one of my great failures in life. And I realized after that experience, you know what? It's time to move on. I don't have any prospect of a musical career, And maybe I better let others sing and lead the music in church. So what I was learning through that was my self-evaluation, right? Now, if I had persisted with music and continued to say, well, maybe I need more lessons and maybe need to try harder and so on and so on, well, I could end up feeling very badly about myself and thinking that I had no value because I was never going to be very good with singing, with musical talent. But fortunately, I guess God gave me some insight or whatever and said, Dave, why don't you move on to something where you might have some ability and talent? And so I was able to take that failure and move along. And I did discover some things that I had more success with. But we're all doing that, aren't we? We all have successes and failures, and that has an impact on our self-worth, our value. And finally, life experiences. So your life experiences, my life experiences, our life experiences will have an impact on what kind of value we have. If you come from an environment and have circumstances of plenty, that can have, it could possibly have a positive impact. I could see where it could have a negative impact on your self-worth. But certainly if you came from a circumstance of deprivation, that is also going to have an impact on your sense of value and may pull you more into the direction of a self-depreciation. So that's why this topic of self-depreciation is so critical, because it is connected to this sense of self and self-evaluation. So let's talk for a few minutes about the origins of self-depreciation. Okay, the origins of self-depreciation. As I mentioned before, there's no question that there are individual differences between us in terms of the degree to which this negativity about the self is a problem. And if you are already thinking that you are suffering from low self-worth, low self-esteem, and inferiority complex, and that self-depreciation is a problem for you, then there are many different experiences where you might say have contributed to that problem. And one of the first one is childhood experience. So if you've come from an abusive family background, let's say, and that abuse, not only physical abuse, but emotional abuse, where you were berated and you were name calling, yelling, or swearing, and so on. So emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse certainly will have an impact on creating a sense of I'm not as worthy as other people. Neglect, if you've come from had a childhood experience of neglect, maybe being left alone or neglected parenting or grandparenting. And again, you would probably end up with a message that I'm not worthy of attention, that I'm not worthy of love and care. And that could have an impact in creating this sense of self-depreciation. Bullying at home, bullying at school. And we're now just beginning to recognize how critical bullying is to creating this sense of a negative view of the self. And of course, now it's not only face-to-face bullying, but our young people have to be fearful of cyberbullying and bullying that occurs through social media. And so bullying and harassment can have, in fact, excessive criticism from your parents or your grandparents, from siblings, from playmates. All of these experiences can leave you with that message that you're unworthy of little value or not as much value as others. A second set of origins of self-depreciation might be experiences of loss or failure, separations, death, illness, job loss, job stagnation, which would be being stuck in a job you hate and you feel you're capable of so much more, but you can't seem to move on. Experiences of loss and failure can lead you to think that, to have a negative view of yourself and so on. And so, as you can see, those experiences of loss or failure could occur early in life or at any time throughout life. Unfulfilled goals and aspirations are another source of self-depreciation. So if you're in your career, in your family, in your relationships, even in your spiritual growth, your relationship with God, if you feel like you had goals and aspirations that have not been met, that you had these big dreams, let's say, and maybe the dreams aren't even so big, but they were dreams, and now you've several years later, and you can see where those dreams, those goals, those aspirations are not going to be met. This can leave you with a sense of failure and a negativity towards yourself. Self-depreciation. Experiences of shame and wrongdoing or regret. Maybe you've made some serious mistakes in the past. You've done things that have hurt yourself or hurt others, and now you look back in shame. You look back with regrets. Maybe there are important missed opportunities. You've made some bad decisions in life. Maybe you've wronged others. Maybe you've wronged loved ones, children, a spouse. All of these experiences can leave you with a sense of negativity towards yourself, a sense of self-depreciation. And finally, experiences of helplessness or loss of control. And this is where you might feel kind of like a sense of being a victim in life, that events are happening in your life and you seem to have very little control over it. It leaves you having a sense that you're weak or helpless, and that you don't have strength and ability and resource or resilience. And so this then leads you to conclude, to evaluate yourself in a very negative way, to engage in a lot of negative self-talk. There are probably other causes or contributors to self-depreciation, but these are some of the more important ones that I can think of, or I've recognized through my practice and what we know from the research literature as well. So let's look at the consequences of self-depreciation. And I've put under this just as a kind of reminder that what we're talking about here is excessive and persistent self-criticism, this excessive negativity toward the self, a hopelessness about yourself or about the future. Okay, so what are some of the consequences of self-depreciation? Well, the first one that we need to talk about is depression. So one of the core features of depression is a negative view of oneself, one's personal world, and one's future. Okay, so depression, I've listed just some of the core symptoms of depression: a persistent sadness that lasts most of the day, day after day, for at least 2 weeks, a loss of interest or pleasure in activities, a sense of worthlessness, difficulty sleeping. I could have added loss of appetite, lack of energy, fatigue or tiredness, difficulty concentrating, loss of motivation. These are all the classic signs of depression. And if you have been struggling with depression, it is likely that self-depreciation is an underlying cause of that depression. You can think of it as like jet fuel for depression. If you have a negative view of yourself, that is going to put you at increased risk for depression. But also when you are depressed, it's going to make the depressions much more intense. So a consequence of self-depreciation is depression. Suicidality is also a great concern who are have excessive negative views of the self. In other words, we can think of self-depreciation as having the possibility of causing harm. And so what do we look for in suicidality? We look for a sense of hopelessness, that when people are at risk for suicide, they often think of their future as hopeless, as empty, as bleak. They think of themselves as being a problem for their family. They'll say, well, if I end my life, then my children, my parents will be able to get on with their lives. I'm a big problem in their life. And if I were to end my life, then that problem would go away. Another risk factor is this view that death is the solution to one's pain and suffering in this life. And we could add some other risk factors as well, people who are maybe a bit impulsive, and if you have access to lethal weapons, all of those factors increase risk for suicide. But behind all of that, underneath all of that, is this profound negativity towards oneself, this self-depreciation. So if you or a family member, if you see these signs of risk for suicide in yourself or family members, please seek help. Talk about it to people you are close to. Because what we know is that suicidality is what we call situational, it's transient. And that often people feel suicidal at a moment in time, but if they can be supported and helped through that dark time, that the future can be much better. So, suicidality. Rumination is another consequence of self-depreciation. Often people, when they're negative about themselves, they get stuck on past mistakes and failures. And so they're thinking about it over and over and over again. Why did I do this? How could I have been so stupid? Why was it? There must be something terribly wrong with me. I'm such an immoral person. I'm such a bad person because I did this or that. So they're kind of stuck in that past. But of course, the difficulty with being stuck in the past is we can't change the past. The past is the past. And so all we can do is move beyond and deal with the consequences of past mistakes and failures. But when you're negative about yourself, you're at a higher risk of getting stuck in what we call rumination. A fourth one is anxiety disorders. So self-depreciation can lead to social anxiety, which is where a person is anxious or in social situations because they fear the opinion or negative evaluation of other people. And so if you start by thinking very negatively about yourself, then you can, often people with social anxiety will often have a very low opinion of themselves. Agoraphobia as well, which is the fear of going out, so you're kind of isolated and staying alone. Pathological guilt is another consequence where there's this misplaced and excessive self-blame. Self-depreciation can also lead to disturbed relationships where you feel detached, what I would call detached engagement. You're kind of detached from your spouse or from your children or from friends or family, or you might express a lot of high criticalness, because what happens when people are highly critical of themselves, they're often highly critical of other people as well. And often anger and frustration are the root of anger and frustration can be traced to self-depreciation. And finally, we see personal stagnation as well. We remember Matthew 25, 14 to 30, the parable of the talents, with the person who was given, what was it? I think 10 talents and then 5 talents and then 1 talent or whatever. But the person with the 1 talent went and buried his talent. And so that's easy to do. Your talents can be buried under this, can be buried in this kind of negativity towards the self. So self-deprivation is a very important, if you want to call it, character flaw to deal with, because it has such profound consequences on your quality of life and well-being. So let's look at what can be done about this, and let's look at some empowerment strategies. So again, just as a reminder, we're trying, these empowerment strategies are a way to move from self-depreciation to self-appreciation. Think of those former slide of those two opposites. Well, the first thing you need is self-awareness. So you need to know, am I stuck in self-depreciation? And hopefully through this talk, you've been able to get a sense of whether this topic is relevant for you or not. But you need, in order to make any change in your life, it has to start with some level of awareness of whether or not self-depreciation is a problem for you. The second thing is we need to affirm our intrinsic value, or your intrinsic value. No matter who you are, our starting point is we are all God's creation. We are created in the image of God. We have life. You have life. And it's having that life, the image of God imprinted in us, that gives us our intrinsic value. So that's what we need to start. Now, there's more that we need to do than that. It's not just simply affirming your intrinsic value, but that's where it starts. It's not what you do. It's not how much you've succeeded. It's not how popular you are. That's not what gives you your value. Your intrinsic value starts with you are created in the image of God. The third thing is to correct negative self-talk and beliefs. And this is what I focus a great deal on with my clients, clients who are depressed or anxious. We do a lot of work on self-talk. What are you thinking about you? What do you think about yourself? What are you telling yourself? What do you believe about yourself? Do you believe you're an unlovable person? Do you believe that you cannot succeed, that there is no good in you? Do you believe that you are a bad person? So we identify this negative self-talk and the beliefs, and then we put it to the test. We look for evidence. For example, if you believe that you're an unlovable person, that no one could possibly love you, then we look for the reasons why you might be thinking that way. What is the evidence that no one has loved you? No one could ever love you. And then we look at the evidence for that and the evidence against that. We say, okay, if it's not true that you're an unlovable person, what is the alternative? And the example might be that the alternative is that you are a person who is a bit shy. Maybe you have underdeveloped social skills. And the reason that you don't feel like other people like you, it's because of some of your social skills. So it's not because you are unworthy, but it may be something to do with how you are interacting with other people. So we do a great deal of work on correcting negative self-talk and beliefs. And that's an important empowerment strategy, very, very critical. A fourth one is to modify what we call faulty compensatory behavior. So if you have a negative view of yourself, let's say you're engaged in excessive self-depreciation, I'm not as good as other people, I have no value or worth, or so on, this is going to impact your behavior. So, for example, you might withdraw, you might isolate yourself, you might avoid other people, you might not exercise your talents and abilities, right? Because of having this negativity towards yourself. So what we want to do is to modify that, work on that behavior, right? You might have excessive dependency on other people. And so again, because you feel so badly about yourself, you depend on others for decisions, for taking initiative, and so on, which then makes you excessively dependent. Maybe you're a workaholic. Maybe you're trying to prove your worth and value by excessive work and productivity. And so that might need to be modified or changed. Maybe it's made you extremely critical of yourself, but also critical of other people. Or you are hypersensitive to unfairness. So you're always getting angry because you're always thinking that people are using you unfairly. Maybe that can be traced to an underlying sense of self-depreciation. A fifth thing that you might look at is, are there toxic people in your life? And what I mean by this, are there people in your life who are very negative, maybe very negative towards you, maybe highly critical of you, and you're constantly getting these negative and critical messages communicated to you? Are you able to remove these people from your life in some way? And if you can't remove them completely because they're family members, maybe you can minimize their contact. Their contact with you, or maybe you can develop some what shall I say, some armor against their critical attacks and so on. But that can be a very important factor. Another thing that you might do is learn to assess your strengths and successes. And what I mean by process is not only acknowledging, not just kind of looking in the mirror and saying positive things to yourself, because that's not really going to help you all that much. But what it is to really take some time to think deeply on what is positive about you, what is positive in your life. What are you good at doing? What are your strengths? What are your abilities? What do people appreciate about you? What does your family appreciate about you? And so on. So it's taking a bit of time, not an excessive amount of time, not becoming preoccupied with it, but just taking some time to process your strengths and successes. Seventh, it's important to be goal-directed, have some passion, some life mission. I just recently had a guy, an older man, he was 75, he's 75 in my practice, and has struggled with depression for probably about 25 or 30 years, off and on. And he said to me, he said, I've just gone through life. It just seems like I've had this job, and then I had my family, and now they're all grown up. And it's not like I really planned anything, like I had any real goals. I kind of just fell into the job. And I've just kind of floated through life. I've just kind of gone through life without any real passion, any real kind of goal directedness. And he suffered from depression. And there are many, many people like that. So do you have passion? Do you have a life mission? If you don't, it would be, I need to discover this. I need to work on what that might be. And it would be a kind of a self-discovery exercise. It's important to practice gratitude and forgiveness. So what that means is not only it means acknowledging your blessings, acknowledging what has come your way without you necessarily earning it or whatever. So being grateful, and we're now getting some new research on just how important gratitude can be in reducing negativity and depression and anxiety. The other thing is to be able to discover forgiveness for yourself and for others. And forgiveness is not an easy, it's not just saying certain words, but it's a process. And it can take a lot of time to truly forgive yourself or to forgive others. And sometimes forgiving oneself is the hardest. But again, important work towards moving from self-depreciation to self-appreciation. Learning to be compassionate and express loving kindness towards, again, yourself and to others. You know, as Christians, we know how important it is to show compassion and love towards other people, but we're not so familiar with how you do that towards yourself. And most of us are pretty hard on ourselves, right? We can be even ruthless at times. And if you're mired in self-depreciation, probably are very hard on yourself. And so it's learning compassion and loving kindness. Another empowerment strategy is spiritual enrichment. That is engaging in meditative and conversational prayer. Now, there's some evidence that this kind of prayer can be particularly healing for depression and anxiety and some of the emotional disturbance. Confessional prayer, although necessary, doesn't seem to have the same degree of positive effect, let's say, as meditative and conversational prayer, which is really kind of meditating on the qualities of God and the blessings that he has bestowed upon you and that. So that type of prayer can be very enriching, as well as fellowship. And what we often call as mindfulness is just being aware of what's going through your mind, what you're thinking about, and focusing, as the scriptures say, to focus on the thoughts that are good and wholesome and so on for you. And finally, it's seeking help. If you recognize that depression, anxiety, anger, or suicidal thoughts have a role or are prominent in your life, please, I would beg you, seek help. Rather than suffer and struggle alone and in silence, it's important to reach out through the pastors at Salem Bible Church, reach out to other mental health professionals and counselors in your region. There is so much help that is available out there. You do not need to do this alone. And it may be that working with a counselor on self-depreciation will get you much faster towards self-appreciation than if you tried to do this on your own. So it's been a pleasure to be with you today. If you're interested in any of this, what I've talked about today, I do have some self-help workbooks available. The Anxiety and Worry workbook is, as the title suggests, focus on anxiety and worry. The Negative Thoughts workbook talks about how our negative thoughts can have an impact on worry, shame, humiliation, regrets, and some of these other emotions in one's life. All of these are available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. If you further information, please feel free to visit my website, which is you see listed there. So again, Salem Bible Church, it was wonderful to be with you. I wish I could be with you in person, but I wish you all the best, and God bless you in your ministry and in your lives. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to participate in your Bible study series called Loosed. Bye now.
I am loose from infirmities and disabilities, loose from all that hinders me. Nothing can hold me now. I'm standing on solid ground. The word of the Lord. I've got the victory over my enemies. Who the Son sets free is free indeed. My chains are broken. Thank God.